Let's go back to the phone lines, talk to Jason in Boston, Massachusetts. Jason is listening on Sirius XM 131. Hi, Jason.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about when Jesus said not to call any man father. Kind of like give me a breakdown on that, because I know in Paul's writing, he calls like Timothy and Titus son. It would only assume that they would call Paul father, and such. So if you can give me understanding on that.
Well, you know what? The prologue to your question was brilliant, because that's exactly right. What you've done is, instead of just taking, excuse me, a phrase of the Bible, what you've done is you've contextualized that phrase by testing Scripture in light of Scripture. I think it'd only be fair to our listeners to get an idea of what's going on in this context. So listen closely to what Jesus is saying. And Jesus is talking to the multitudes as well as to his disciples, and he's saying, the scribes and the Pharisees, well, they sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, and they don't do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their little fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. And so they make phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you, do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, namely the Christ. And you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And, you got to really catch this, do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, what's interesting about reading the context, so I flipped open my Bible to this very famous passage, Matthew 23. I haven't taken the time to memorize it, but I flipped this open and I read it to you. Now, I read it to you to give you context. The first thing you see in this context is false teachers. People who want the adulation of people. Don't call them father. Don't even call them teacher, because all they want to be is exalted in the eyes of men. So, over time, and I will say this is particularly true, I hardly say on the radio, Father Steve, who happens to be one of the presbyters. Presbyter shortened means priest. But if I say, I talked to Father Steve, or Father Steve said this, or Father John said this, well, people immediately say, but doesn't the Bible say you're not supposed to call anybody father? And this is one of the problems with Orthodoxy and Catholicism. You've brought yourself into this web of deceit in which people are calling other people father. This is just wrong. The Bible's very clear about this. But the minute someone says that, you know, they simply have something in their head. They haven't ever gone to the Bible to examine this in context, because when you do, you come up with exactly what you said in the prologue to your question. You find out if this is really true, then the Bible must be wrong somewhere else. So what's the idea here? Context, again, concerns the hypocrisy of false teachers puffing themselves up to be glorified by men rather than God. And also, many people like to cite this passage to say that you are in error for using this term, yet the passage also speaks again, about teachers. That's why I put the emphasis there. If we're not supposed to call anybody father, well, why is it that the same people that are complaining about that are calling people teacher? They have no problem with it whatsoever. I mean, I could count the number of times, maybe I can't count the number of times, people have told me, you should not call anybody father. But they don't ever say, you should not call anybody teacher. Well, the context here tells us both. So you have to read Scripture in light of Scripture. Reality is that father and teacher are applied to men many times within the New Testament. But you can't ever do that with people who are false teachers, or you can't do this simply to puff people up and make them as exalted as your notion of God is. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Apostle Paul refers to himself as a father to the Corinthian believers. So if this is taken at face value without considering context, then Paul would be doing something that he shouldn't be doing. Or in Luke 16, one of my favorite passages, I've referred to it a few times on this show, Abraham is approvingly referred to as Father Abraham. In Colossians, you have the approval of the term father as we normally use the word to refer to our own biological fathers. So if you take this in a wooden literalistic sense rather than the sense in which it's intended, you wouldn't even call your own biological father, because that would be in conflict with this passage. Obviously it is not, and that's what I love about what you just did, Jason. When you asked the question, you also contextualized the answer to the question by reading Scripture in light of Scripture, and that was a brilliant move on your part.